Wonderful. So we will pivot to NIH. Like most of us, I found the older I get, the more I'm worshiping at the altar of NIH, and so. In those days, as Santosh pointed out, we weren't very familiar with how do people become the priests, high priests at NIH, and we have one of them, Dr. Ed Ramos. Ed will ask you to begin with your journey, your story.
Yeah, sure. So I think I continue the theme of not having a straight line between points A and B. So I was born in Queens, New York City. My mom came from Lima, Peru, dad from Puerto Rico, both not having college education. So, but both always, so my dad was very much of an engineering mind. My mom was very much of a scientist, kind of question asking mind. So I think that's what framed me. And luckily, through the exposure I got in high school, pursued a degree in biochemistry and molecular biology at Penn State. And it was there where I got even continued exposure, not only in the lab, but this emerging field of bioinformatics and computational science. And at the time, Lee Hood had kicked off his inaugural multidisciplinary PhD program, which was molecular biotechnology at the University of Washington, which is now Department of Genome Sciences. And so I applied and continued on with my graduate work there. But really what occurred in the fourth and fifth year of my studies was an opportunity to then pick my head up and actually look beyond the lab. And what I found was an interest in how policy affects science and how we do research. I was very much involved in issues with regards to retention and recruitment of individuals from underrepresented populations to pursue science, and how we recruited individuals from these populations to take part in research studies, and all that kind of culminated in a desire to do a bit more of that. And so my professional society that I followed was the American Society of Human Genetics. They have a Genetics and Public Policy Fellowship, which is exactly what I thought the vehicle I needed to explore that further. And so you're brought onto NIH campus. You work in the policy shop for almost half a year. And then towards the end of that time, you start identifying what offices in the United States Capitol align with your interests. And then you go through yet another kind of round of interviews. And I was lucky to align with then Senator Obama. He had a genomics and personalized medicine bill. He had stem cell and avian flu and some science questions that I felt I could at least provide some insight on. And so I ended up being a fellow and was hired onto professional staff. He decided to run for president, so this whole component of a presidential campaign, obviously something I had not planned for, but learned a tremendous amount from, and then continued on to the point where I was recruited back from the NIH to pursue a science policy position, as well as continue my research, which kind of had evolved at that point to more of a bioinformatics, population genetics standpoint. So after doing that for several years, another growing passion, kind of continued passion, was again this issue of really tackling inclusion and diversity in the biomedical enterprise, such that when Dr. Francis Collins, who leads the NIH agency, established this Office of Scientific Workforce Diversity, I had offered to do a detail for my research, and then that's where I linked up with Dr. Pettigrew, who is the Institute Director, who was tapped as the interim chief officer. And so from there, we developed a working relationship such that when that detail ended, he recruited me to his institute with a number of ideas, one of which was to kind of help bolster the fledgling division of health informatics technologies. And by way of right place, right time, I'm now the acting division director of that new component to the NIH.
Yes. Santosh has mentioned multiple times, and it's very impressive at this age you have reached where you have. And there is this general trope about bureaucracy and the government, and yet we know people like Wendy Nielsen, Bill Riley, Richard Conroy, Melissa Riddle, wonderful, thoughtful administrators who genuinely care. They're very invested. They're great scientists, but they spend a lot of time nurturing science and nurturing the people who will do science. And so we've seen that side of the NIH that is not immediately manifest to most people. So what excites you there? Being in the position you are in, and what are some of the challenges you face?
Yes, absolutely. So I think the breadth of science that I'm exposed to is fascinating. So on any given day, I'm on conference calls with investigators that are working on integrated monitoring systems for pediatric asthma, to developing a molecular map of molecular transducers of physical activity, to the work that's done here in MD2K and data privacy and data security and my other MD2K portfolios, as well as a variety of M health initiatives. So just being able to see the cutting edge of science, and then when applicable, be able to throw in my 2 cents in terms of programmatic direction is extremely exciting. And so to kind of contrast it with your training, for example, as a PhD, where you're diving extremely deep, but in a relatively narrow field. Mine is extremely wide, with not as much depth, but with the opportunity to dive in certain areas. And to me, that's exactly what I was looking for. In terms of challenges, yeah, at the end of the day, I think what a lot of program officers struggle with is we have a large customer service component to our job. And that means dealing with a lot of different types of people, a lot of different types of personalities. And so sometimes it can be challenging to look past the emotions that you're getting from investigators that are having trouble getting funding, or don't understand why their research doesn't align with our institute, to eventually help them, because that's really the end point of the job. And so keeping that in mind can be a challenge.
So our wonderfully talented grad students, there is going to be a subset that will want to express their altruism through government service, using the NIH as a platform for expressing their altruism. And what kind of skills and experiences do you think, based on your own experiences, would benefit the most?
Yeah, so I think, looking back on my career, I'm grateful that I'm able to leverage each aspect. And my time on the Hill forced me to step out of my technical world and learn a new set of communication skills to the general public, and not just writing, but also speaking. And that has, again, been a theme this afternoon. But specifically, obviously, you need to be able to be a solid technical writer, but also being able to step back. And when you're given that big picture vision, it's really not at that in the weeds detail. And so I think being able to have that additional communication component and skill set is extremely valuable. And it plays to this idea of getting across your vision and the big picture.
So obviously, someone young, and if I may use young in in an admiring way, is what are the traits that allow you to successfully navigate? It's a very articulated, dense, complex NIH with so many institutes and offices. What are the traits that allow you to negotiate them so successfully?
So again, much of this I leverage from what I learned on the Hill, which is you can't be successful in pushing any kind of policy forward without establishing some sort of network and collaborative process. You need partners in any endeavor that you do on the Hill, and I don't think that's any different in the sciences, and specifically as a program director, in a very small institute in which we have to leverage our institutes and our partners that have larger budgets and bigger programs and portfolios, and establishing those partnerships. And so I'm a big fan of Malcolm Gladwell, and one of his books, he kind of describes different types of people, and I try to be a connector, which was one of the personas that he describes, and I've found that not just a connector within the NIH, but also a connector for my investigators, and that's what brings me a tremendous amount of joy is being able to say, oh my gosh, this person was just talking about how they need this area of expertise. I have the perfect person that they should communicate with. It doesn't always work out, but when it does, it's nice to see that had that not been made, it would have been a missed opportunity. So,
that's a very important point. I want to reinforce that. It doesn't matter whether you work in industry or academia or in the government. All these are large social organizations. You have to understand there are people. You have to understand what is being said, but also what is left unsaid. And you have to develop not just your technical IQ, but your social IQ. Because it's not always being about smart and brilliant. I've seen too many of them fail because they don't relate, they don't connect. So whichever direction you go, make sure that your social connectedness dimension is also equally developed. And thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
How do you handle?
So
sorry,
just quickly, Dr. Pettigrew often talks about EQ, emotional quotient, in terms of what you just said, and he has been not only a mentor but a huge supporter of my career, and I live by that. So I'm glad to hear you.
No, it's just different frames of reference, but there are common traits that work. So, what typically is the trajectory for someone interested in coming on as eventually being a program officer and reaching your level?
Yeah, so it's approached in a variety of different ways. So we have a lot of my colleagues were academicians, researchers that establish themselves and are able to bring a tremendous amount of content, expertise, and specific knowledge to a given field. And you see that often. Another aspect is at the end of the day, take MD2K for example. While I may feel comfortable in a very specific component of it, there's no way I'm going to be expert across all the different areas that have been presented over the last couple of days, for example. And so for me, I have to leverage my programmatic skills, management skills, and oversight, and ensuring that I'm pointing out the areas that benefit the program as a whole. And so a lot of the program officers sometimes come with more of that project management experience and are able to apply it in a program direction.
It brings us to that big question. Sorry.
I would also like to ask some advice about maintaining the work-life balance. You're managing this many projects, many high-profile individuals, the scientists, so many different institutions, then dealing with investigators who are upset, then dealing with your colleagues from other institutes, then thinking about how to build the next portfolio and the next program. So there is a lot that goes on. Yeah. How do you maintain the work-life balance?
Yeah, I heard Larry Tabak, who's deputy to Dr. Collins, once used the phrase "boiling the ocean," and I do feel like I have to be mindful of not trying to boil the ocean in terms of taking all those things on, moving them all forward at once. So for me, it's being strategic, and again, it comes to always being mindful of what those connecting points are, so that I can let others do the work. I put the two people that really should be talking and not me talking to them, and then just kind of keep an eye on that. So part of that is, but memory helps quite a bit. So in fact, a lot of my note taking over the last couple of days has to do with the PRISMS project that Santosh, you're now going to be involved in, which is integrated monitoring systems for pediatric asthma, and I have a list of things that I think that program needs to be mindful of the work that MD2K is doing. So always trying to kind of keep it swirling around in my head and making those associations. But in terms of work-life balance, I have 3 children. 16 months up to 8 years old. So I don't have a choice. I have to balance. And it's interesting, because you think about, I can bend my day in terms of working out, commuting, work, commuting, coming back home, and finding some time, family time, and sleep. And there are recommendations on how you should do all of that. You should work out at least an hour a day, and you should get 8 hours of sleep. And I well exceed 24 hours a day if I'm to adhere to all these recommendations. So it's just a matter of, and I actually use that as a guide to say, all right, well, I'm not going to compromise almost to the minute X number of hours for these activities. And I think it's a comfort level. Early on, when I'm working on the Hill, which is an absolute crazy place in terms of, there are times where I would see constituents throughout the day and actually not start my job until 5 o'clock in the evening. And I didn't see the light of day coming home for the 2 years that I worked on the Hill. And I kind of knew that going in, and I was resigned to that fact. And my wife knew that was the strategy. It was a plan. But I never worked weekends. And I knew that wasn't going to be my life for the next 5 to 10 years. And so I think it's a lot about planning, sticking to that plan. If you have a partner or spouse, leaning on them to remind you of that plan. But it is a challenge. It's a constant challenge. And my wife is a program director at Genome Institute, so it's not like she's not busy. So that actually helps, because I have always viewed us at an equal playing field, and so I never feel like, oh well, I should have a little more time at work than she does. So that has been a huge plus for me.
Are the questions before we go into? Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was wondering if this distinction between breadth and depth, if you could comment on, as a program officer, evaluating the competency of someone that's applying for a grant, as far as breadth versus depth of their capacity.
Would you repeat that so we can?
Yes. So if I'm understanding kind of the program director's role in evaluating where the applicant is coming from with regards to how broad their not only their thinking but their experiences is, and how deep it is with regards to what they're actually proposing. Is that along? So for us, we use the guide of what it is they're applying for. So if they're applying to a very specific program, that's usually a little easier conversation, because we know exactly what it is we want from the applicants and the eventual awardees. And sometimes breadth is huge. So take sensor, and this is something I had mentioned earlier in terms of sensor development. There's the engineering side of things, and there's downstream informatics and analyses. And if that's something that we want captured programmatically, then we would love to see that breadth. And other times we have to take into consideration of, oh my gosh, this person is so stretched out across all these different types of areas. Are they really the right person to focus on this very specific area that we want them to focus on? So it's a balance, and it's very contextual. It's a good question.
Any other questions? Dr. Ramos, this is terrific. We thank you for